In 1933, a newly built Russian cargo ship was assigned an ambitious task: navigate the icy waters of northeastern Russia through the Arctic Ocean to prove that the fabled Northern Sea route could become a permanent trade corridor. But like so many vessels before it, this ship would find itself locked in unforgiving ice, drifting helplessly for months before disaster struck. This is the incredible story of the maiden voyage and tragic fate of the SS Chelyuskin, the Arctic dream. Of Russia for centuries, the frozen top of the world had captured Russian imagination. The Arctic wasn't just a remote wasteland. It represented opportunity, pride, and strategic importance. Russian explorers had ventured into these regions as early as the mid-1600s. In 1648, the legendary seafarer Semyon Dezhnev sailed north and east around Siberia, proving something crucial: Asia and North America were not joined by land, but separated by water. If a seaway existed here, it could link Europe and the Pacific far more directly than the long southern routes. Over the next 300 years, explorers from Russia and beyond made sporadic attempts to trace this route, later called the Northeast Passage. But the Arctic had its own rules: bitter winters, months of darkness, and seas that turned solid with ice. Wooden ships were crushed or frozen in place, forced to overwinter until the spring thaw. The Soviet push to conquer the North after the 1917 Russian Revolution. The new Soviet leadership launched bold industrial and scientific projects. One priority was exploiting Siberia's rich natural resources. To do that efficiently, the government wanted a reliable shipping lane running along Russia's northern coast, what they called the Northern Sea Route. To break through the thick ice, they deployed powerful new vessels called icebreakers, ships, with reinforced hulls designed to smash through frozen seas. In addition, aircraft began assisting these voyages by scouting ahead, locating safer channels through the ice. By the late 1920s, Soviet polar pilots and ship captains were becoming national heroes, while Moscow poured money and planning into Arctic exploration. In 1932, Professor Otto Schmidt, a mathematician turned Arctic pioneer, led a daring expedition. Using an icebreaker, he successfully traversed the Northern Sea route in a single navigation season for the first time. This proved the passage was technically possible, but not necessarily practical. Most icebreakers were small, lacked cargo capacity, and weren't built for such long distances. If the route was to become a true trade artery, they needed ships that could haul significant freight across the top of the world. A new ship for a new mission. In 1933, Soviet authorities decided to repeat Schmidt's voyage, but this time with a brand new cargo vessel, the SS Chelyuskin. Stronger than typical merchant ships, it was specially reinforced to endure harsh Arctic conditions. Schmidt even described it as a semi-icebreaker, though it still lacked the raw power of a dedicated ice-crushing ship. The Chelyuskin launched from Leningrad, modern St. Petersburg, on July 12, 1933, under the same captain Schmidt had worked with the previous year. After a stop in Copenhagen to fine-tune the engines and a final pause in Murmansk, the vessel began its historic crossing on August 10. The route spanned 6 frigid seas. The first, the Barents Sea, was relatively clear of ice thanks to warmer Atlantic currents. But the Kara Sea lived up to its fearsome reputation. Plates of ice bent the ship's stern and cracked its hull. Repairs held, but the damage foreshadowed worse to come. Still, there were moments of joy. Near Cape Chelyuskin, a crew member gave birth to a baby girl, named Karina in honor of the Kara Sea. The ship pressed onward, passing into the Laptev and East Siberian seas. By autumn, the Chelyuskin was plowing through ice cover as high as 90%, though thin enough to push aside. Then they reached the Chukchi Sea, the final stretch before the Bering Strait. Here the ice was thicker than anyone expected. Progress slowed to a crawl. A reconnaissance flight revealed open water only 16 miles away, but too far for the trapped vessel to reach. On September 21, 1933, the Chelyuskin ground to a halt. Its rudder bent 20 degrees, leaving the ship at the mercy of drifting ice floes. Drifting toward disaster, the current carried them eastward, toward a deep bay north of the Bering Strait notorious for crushing pack ice and blinding whiteouts. In early October, help arrived unexpectedly. Chukchi villagers traveled 25 kilometers by dog sled to offer assistance. But they could evacuate only a few men, including one who was gravely ill and others whose government duties were urgent. Schmidt prepared the ship for winter, knowing they might be trapped for months. Coal supplies became a concern. The ship's mechanic cleverly mixed alternative fuels, paraffin, waste oil, even animal fat, to save precious coal. Drinking water had to be produced by melting ice. Meanwhile, the crew passed long polar nights. By skiing, holding friendly races around the ship, and listening to Schmidt's evening science talks in November, Schmidt pleaded with the icebreaker Litke for rescue. But Litke's engines were weak, and the frozen seas were too formidable. Attempts to reach the Chelyuskin failed. The crew would have to wait for spring, or hope the ice released them sooner. By December, total darkness set in. The Chelyuskin drifted in unpredictable circles, sometimes nearing the Alaskan coast before currents pulled it back north. As the ice grew thicker, the hull groaned under mounting pressure. Schmidt and his engineers knew it was only a matter of time before disaster struck. The day the ice won on February 12, 1934, inspectors found cracks forming in nearby ice sheets, signs the colossal floes were shifting. The next day, at 1 p.m., shutters rocked the ship. Ice pressed against the hull, bending steel, crushing cabins, twisting bulkheads. Plates on the upper deck bulged and burst. The Chelyuskin listed sharply as Schmidt ordered emergency stores moved onto the ice. Crewmen slid crates, fuel drums, and personal belongings down planks to a waiting tent camp. At 2:30 p.m., violent jolts tore through the vessel. Water flooded compartments. The bow dipped forward, then the entire ship lurched. The captain shouted the order, "Abandon ship." Men scrambled onto the ice while Schmidt and the captain stayed aboard to throw off anything useful. In the chaos, ship animals were slaughtered for food supplies. The passenger deck flooded. The radio was dismantled and sent ashore with a final SOS. One by one, sailors leapt from the heaving deck to the frozen surface below. The last man aboard, the quartermaster, tried to jump, but at that moment, the Chelyuskin flipped violently. The stern and rudder rose into the air as the vessel broke apart and plunged beneath the ice, dragging the quartermaster down with it. He was the expedition's sole fatality. The entire crew, over 100 survivors, watched their ship vanish into the polar sea. Exhausted and shaken, Schmidt ordered them to set up camp immediately, establish radio contact, and rest for the night. Survival on the ice. By morning, supplies floated up from the wreck, giving them barrels of fuel and construction materials. The Soviet government quickly organized a massive rescue operation. The plan: build an airstrip on the ice so airplanes could evacuate as many people as possible, while others would be transported by dog sled to Cape Vankerem, then onward to Alaska, London, Berlin, and finally back to Russia, the survivors named their drifting base, Camp Schmidt. Maintaining the airstrip was grueling. Shifting floes cracked it 13 times, forcing the crew to rebuild or relocate repeatedly. Women on board objected when Schmidt insisted they be airlifted first along with children and the sick, proof of how equally they'd worked during the ordeal, but Schmidt refused to compromise. Meanwhile, legendary pilot Sigismund Levanevsky volunteered for the rescue. In March 1934, he and fellow explorer Georgy Ushakov flew from Fairbanks, Alaska, across the Bering Strait. Blizzard conditions and icing nearly killed them when their instruments froze and engines faltered. They crash-landed in the same bay where the Chelyuskin had been trapped months before, but survived thanks to local help. Other pilots soon joined the mission. By April, as Arctic weather briefly cleared, Soviet aviators flew 7 aircraft in repeated trips between Cape Vankerem and Camp Schmidt, evacuating 55 people. The rest traveled safely by dog sled under escort. Return and recognition. After 8 months stranded in the ice, the survivors returned to Soviet territory with only one casualty. The quartermaster lost with the ship. The pilots who braved the Arctic skies were celebrated as heroes of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. The voyage itself was deemed a partial success. Despite tragedy, the expedition had reached the Bering Strait, proving that even non-ice-breaking cargo ships could traverse most of the Northern Sea route. In the years that followed, the USSR built stronger vessels and expanded Arctic shipping. But even today, despite modern icebreakers, satellite navigation, and climate change, the Northern Sea route remains treacherous and unpredictable. At IN 2006, divers located fragments of the Chelyuskin lying 50 meters beneath the Chukchi Sea, a silent reminder of the perils faced by the ship and its crew.